We are off. We are off to a roaring start with Dr. Wilson this morning, which is interesting because I understand that Dr. Wilson, what as he mentioned, was part of the EPA National Environmental Justice Advisory Council meeting that went. The public session started at 6 and went until 10:30 p.m. last night. So I don't know how he has all the energy and all the fire that he has so early this morning, but he does. And so let us try and bring that forward into our conversation. And we are missing two panelists. I see Samuel Jordan in the stack, but we are not able to hear him. So we're going to continue to work with him. He and I were having some serious technical difficulties this morning trying to get into the conference, and Samuel is having difficulty with us being able to hear him. We are also expecting another participant, another presenter, but I'm going to introduce everyone, and hopefully everyone will be able to join us before we get to the end of this session. So we are joined this morning by some amazing, amazing people. I am Vernice Miller Travis, Executive Vice President at the Metropolitan Group for Environmental Justice and Social Justice. I'm a 24-year resident of Prince George's County, Maryland. Dr. Wilson and I live in the same town, along with Dr. Adrian Hollis, who will be on two other panels today. We're holding it down in Bowie. Thank you very much. Along with the University of Maryland, that's just two towns over from us in College Park. But we are joined by Samuel Jordan, or we will be joined by Samuel Jordan, president of the Baltimore Transit and Equity Coalition. We will also be joined by Elizabeth Bunn, Maryland State Director for the Labor Network for Sustainability. We are joined by Kate Zyla, Executive Director of the Georgetown Climate Center. Oh, Elizabeth is already here. What am I talking about? Elizabeth is already here. And the inimitable Jackie Patterson, Director of the Chisholm Legacy Project, a newly established venture that Jackie has just launched this very week. And so hopefully she will squeeze in some talk to tell us what the Chisholm Legacy Project is going to be doing. But I wanted to just offer some framing comments, which are these. We know, those of us who live in EJ communities, who work with EJ communities, who work with underserved communities, we know that one of the driving forces of inequity, of pollution, of residential segregation, of inequitable uses of land, of transportation corridors as real sources of visible separation by race of communities. We know that the history of the transportation sector has been one that has borne a very, very heavy burden for communities of color, for low-income communities, for tribal communities, for immigrant communities. We often see the infrastructure. The infrastructure usually goes through our communities, but it doesn't often serve our communities. And in going through our communities and transgressing our communities, we also bear a heavy pollution burden. So it could be from airports, it could be from seaports, it could be from rail lines, it could be from bus barns, it could be from storage of transportation facilities. But we often get the negative impacts of transportation infrastructure, but we're not often served by transportation infrastructure. And one thing I would, just from a historical guide point, one thing I would posit in all of your minds to think about, if you have not had any firsthand experience with the disproportionate impact of transportation infrastructure in EJ and disproportionate impacted communities, I would give you this example. A few months ago, we had a national conversation in our country about the Tulsa race riots in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And many people learned about what had happened, the terrible, horrible racial riots that had happened in that community and that ultimately destroyed that community. I'm not as sure that people understood the second and third iteration of that story, which is that the African American community, a Greenwood community in Tulsa, built that community back, even though it had been burnt down to the ground. All its infrastructure, people murdered, people disappeared. They literally built that community back with their own hands. They built their businesses back, their homes back. Roughly a 40 square block community was built back, even though it had been utterly, utterly, utterly destroyed. And it went on and existed for many years. And then the Federal Department of Transportation decided to build and expand the federal highway system. And they drove that highway, the development of that highway, right through the Greenwood community. It was the highway development that ultimately destroyed that community such that it could not be built back. Today, there is 1 square block left of the Greenwood community, but most of it was eradicated by not just the race riots from the 1920s, but from the highway development in the 1950s to the 1970s. And it's that kind of impact, that kind of dispossession, that kind of upheaval that transportation infrastructure has rendered across our country. And so, but we find ourselves in an interesting moment. And that interesting moment is that there are many conversations going on at the federal level, the Justice 40 conversation, the Energy Department conversations about new infrastructure, the Justice 40 conversation about making sure that 40% of all federal investments are going to go to disadvantaged communities and or also EJ communities. We see a number of efforts happening around the country. We see this infrastructure bill bringing forward new potential investments for new transportation, expanded transportation, green transportation, modernization of the transportation infrastructure. There's a lot going on. And the question is, will we learn from the experiences of the past, or will we replicate some of the difficult, discriminatory, and incredibly environmentally impactful decisions and actions that have done from the past? Will we learn from those experiences, and will we create a new, more vibrant, more just, more equitable system? And so we're going to focus our conversation this morning on what's happening in Maryland, and what's happening in the DMV, DC, Maryland, and Virginia. We might want to throw Delaware in there too, because all of our transportation systems are so interconnected. But we really are going to focus on Maryland, and not just the DC part of Maryland, but the whole of our state. Who's being served, who's not being served, and what needs to happen. So I'm going to start by asking each of our panelists to please give us, thank you, Samuel, there you are on the screen. So happy to see your face. I'm going to ask each of you to take just 2 minutes to give us an opening statement about how you see these issues, how you see this moment of opportunity in history, and then we're going to get into our questions. So I'm going to start with Jackie, if I may.
Thank you so much. Good morning. It is always an honor and a joy to share space with you, Sister Vernice, and with the other people on the panel. I look forward to this conversation, everyone who's out here listening. My name is Jackie Patterson. I am the founder and executive director of the Chisholm Legacy Project, a resource hub for Black frontline climate justice leadership. So the Chisholm Legacy Project really has 4 foci: community building, movement building, bending the arc of mainstream environmentalism and climate responses towards equity and justice, and Black femme leadership support. So this conversation couldn't be more better placed in the context of those foci. So I look forward to having this discussion with you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. Samuel, can you give us just a 2-minute blurb on the work of the Baltimore Transit Equity Coalition?
Perhaps even less. I'm Samuel Jordan, and good morning to each of you. President of the Baltimore Transit Equity Coalition, BTEC. And we have endured over 6 years, most of that time alone, denouncing race-based transit policy and demanding and pursuing the completion of the Red Line Light Rail project in Baltimore. The tide is turning, and urban rail is slowly being recognized as the mode most capable of meeting the transit equity and intersectional roles that public transportation must fill when land use, public health, environmental concerns, and transportation policies are developed together.
Thank you, Samuel. Elizabeth.
Yeah, let me also express my appreciation to you, Vernice, and to my fellow panelists, all of whom I've worked with on one project or another, and I'm humbled to be on this panel with you all. So just quickly, Labor Network for Sustainability aims to bridge the divide between the environmental and labor movements, and with the goal of pushing the envelope, building bridges, so that we can build a future that's both sustainable ecologically, but also prosperous economically, with a just transition for all who are affected. I think that transportation, and more specifically transit, is key to this conversation for all the reasons that Vernice started out with, but also because that we already have a fantastic foundation of alliances between unions that represent transit workers and EJ communities, both in Maryland, but also nationally. Finally, I would just say transit also gives us an opportunity to build back our manufacturing sector if we're smart and intentional about how we spend our procurement dollars and invest in our communities first and foremost.
Thank you. And last but not least, my colleague, Kate Zyla. Kate?
Thank you, Vernice, and echo all the other panelists' appreciation for this group and Elizabeth's expression of humility at being in such a wonderful group for this conversation. I am the executive director of the Georgetown Climate Center, which is a research, law, and policy organization based at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. I just became the executive director in May. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. I'll say that what we do at the Climate Center is to work with state and local policymakers to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and also to improve resilience and adaptation to climate change. We work on transportation issues with states and cities up and down the East Coast, but I'm actually coming to you today from Michigan, where I'm visiting my family. I'm from the Detroit area, not from Maryland originally. I just wanted to say, Vernice, one of the things that really strikes me about your introduction is how similar these issues are everywhere. Detroit is currently in the middle of a big conversation right now about a highway that was put right through the Black Bottom neighborhood in Detroit in the 1960s. And such a familiar story of a thriving community of residents and businesses that were demolished for this highway, I-375 in the 60s. And they are now trying to think about what Detroit should do to sort of address the legacy of this highway. So it's such a pervasive issue that you're raising here. And I look forward to talking about it with everyone today. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. And let me also lift up a colleague who is really the co-facilitator of this panel, Ramon Valencia Calvo from Chispa of the Maryland League of Conservation Voters. Ramon really was the person who made sure that this panel happened at the conference this year. Ramon is in Spain visiting his family. He reached out to everyone. He did most of the outreach for our panelists. He was a total driver of this conversation, but I believe he is unable to join us from Spain today, but know that he is here in spirit, and I just want to lift up Ramon's name for having gotten us here to this moment. So my first question for the panelists is, in order for our region, DC, Maryland, and Virginia, for our region to meet its transportation needs and the needs of communities that have been historically neglected by transportation infrastructure, a number of changes need to happen. What transportation equity initiatives are you involved in to work towards a better system? Let's start with Samuel, then Elizabeth, then Jackie, then Kate.
Thank you.
Samuel?
Thank you. You can still hear me.
Yes, perfectly.
I want to answer quickly, but comprehensively if possible. And that is, first, we've learned that the way you frame the question is the cruel beginning of the story. So in a society governed by racism and all public policy, patterns in housing, healthcare, education, public health, employment, food security, and transportation are all linked by the need to guarantee underdevelopment and adverse outcomes for people of color. So when the transit system crises emerge, the usual answer is give the Black people a bus and don't spend a penny more. So that's where we are now. And modal choice is rampant. So the initiatives that we've taken or involved in now are aimed at calling this a bus and automobile era. That is the era between streetcars and light rail. And it is also the era of white flight. It is the era of the horrors of driving while Black. And the initiative that we're taking also include insisting that the transit equity movement is also an environmental movement, and the environmental movement must also be a transit equity movement. Now, just quickly on some of the initiatives, and hopefully we can get back to some of the general discussion, but we certainly want to complete the Red Line Light Rail project. And that project, or in the course of it, we are hoping to educate the general public on the difference between transit simply conceived as a movement from point A to B to what we need in Baltimore. Baltimore needs massive economic and community development. Buses don't deliver that. And as you know, you've heard us say 1,000 times, development follows rail. Buses follow development. Another initiative that we're working on, of course, is what we call destination access equity. We emphasize, of course, transit access, equitable transit access, but we need also to emphasize destination access. Many people need to get to their destinations and can't in Baltimore within 90 minutes. 2 out of 3 jobs cannot be reached within 90 minutes by public transportation. We also have a last mile barrier project. We can speak about that, but again, that's dealing with destination equity. An employer survey. So many employers have told us they have no idea how their employees get to work. We've developed a survey so that they can understand when an employee is late and says it was because I depended upon an unreliable transit system, they're not always lying. The employers believe that they can honestly not be telling the truth. We have a mapping study to identify the communities most in need of interventions and mitigation from the impact of pollution on public health. We have a legislative initiative to put equity in another framework, rather than equity being a matter that we address with respect to correction and reparations. We're looking at it as a map that requires anticipation and prevention. We can speak about that, but we're also planning a campaign for free transit for essential workers and youth. Now, we have allies who voiced an interest in this campaign, but I want to stop there, Vernice, because there are several other initiatives that can be discussed in the course of our conversation.
And I'm going to ask some questions about the Red Line again in the context of the new infrastructure plan.
Absolutely.
Elizabeth, what are you all working on at the Labor Sustainability Network?
Yeah, thanks. So at the national level, there's an initiative that we've been engaged in for 4 years. It's a partnership between LNS and the American Amalgamated Transit Union, ATU, and that's to designate February 4th, which is Rosa Parks' birthday, as Transit Equity Day. Recently, we've pivoted with Samuel's participation to begin that campaign on December 23rd, which was the actual successful end of the Montgomery bus boycott. So we're kind of bookending those 2 historic events in the name of building coalitions. So that's an ongoing effort of ours. And you know, importantly, we're trying to build coalitions at the local level, real labor, EJ, transit rider coalitions. Which in and of itself is a full-time job. One thing I do want to add about since you raised it, Vernice, about the bipartisan infrastructure deal, and going back to your opening remarks, from the moment of the framework of that deal to the actual deal, there was several billions of dollars that were stripped out. And so you might ask, what projects were hurt the most? And they were transit, they were taking the lead out of pipes, and they were electrifying school buses. So all the billions of dollars that the original framers, which had Republicans on it, thought were unnecessary, they picked the 3 that really hit equity the hardest. But right now, we're trying to get some more money back into transit at the federal level, but more importantly, and I think for this group, is we're trying to figure out a plan for making sure that whatever money gets to the states and local transit agencies, that it's spent in accordance with the intent of that money. We had the experience with President Obama. We had the great stimulus bill, but a lot of the money was misspent at the local level. So we're trying to work with local groups on those issues. In Maryland, I just want to mention 2 or 3 things. Of course, we're still very actively involved with making sure that the Transit Safety and Investment Act, which was passed by the legislature and vetoed by Governor Hogan, that veto is overridden in December when the legislature meets in special session. We're also working on electrification of both passenger and school buses, but trying to make sure that worker standards are included in those bills. Those bills, you know, operators and maintenance employees on buses will be affected by electrification. The unions represent those workers by and large support electrification, but they want to make sure that there's standards built in so that their members and workers don't suffer as a result. And I will mention in that context, in Maryland, the buses that are purchased by MTA, there was a bill that mandates electrification over time, but the pieces of the bill that included labor standards were stripped at the last minute. So this is just another example of how equity seems always to go, it's always the first to be omitted and the last to be added. And again, I don't want to take up time from other panelists, so I'll stop there.
Thank you, Elizabeth. All really important points, and we will be circling back to a lot of the things that you lifted up. Kate?
Sure, thank you, Vernice. So a few projects I'd love to mention. One is that we work pretty broadly with states on some sort of evaluation tools and strategies for how to think about where they put investments in transportation infrastructure and try to understand how to calculate and how to demonstrate the benefits, both environmental, public health, safety, economic, jobs, benefits of investing in transportation infrastructure and services. But the piece that's, I think, most directly relevant to the DMV area is work we do with the Transportation and Climate Initiative, which is a group of states on the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic coast working to reduce emissions from transportation and also to raise funds that can be invested in the kinds of projects and services that we're talking about here today. So while I'm hopeful that there's some really important dedicated funding coming from the federal government to help states and communities invest in transit and other transportation projects, we're really also trying to find a source of more sustained, more targeted funding that can be available for longer term projects and services.
Thank you. And Jackie?
Thank you so much. So the Chisholm Legacy Project's inspiration is Shirley Chisholm, and she had a famous quote, "If you don't have a seat at the table, bring a folding chair." So as a national organization that's supporting state and local work, in the vein of the 2 buckets I talk about in terms of community and movement building, the work of the Chisholm Legacy Project is about equipping communities to bring that folding chair. So for us, that means building the capacity of communities to lead on these conversations. So I'm continuing the work that we started with NAACP and now working in collaboration to develop a transportation equity toolkit that's specific to the work of Black frontline communities and others. We're developing a set of state and local action briefs and also developing an equitable transportation training and certification program. So this is all towards the end that communities have the data, they have the analysis, and they have the strategy to actually transform the transportation sector to one that serves their interests in terms of environmental justice, racial justice, health justice, economic justice, and beyond. So through the toolkits, the communities will be able to test and monitor their air, water, and soil, as well as to measure what vehicles are coming through their communities, how often, and spewing which toxins. Through the briefs, communities will be equipped with health surveillance data about the health conditions in their communities that are tied to the toxins that they found through their monitoring. Communities will also learn how to compare their transit access with that of others and conduct a racial justice analysis, as well as they'll learn how to advocate for equal access to bus and train routes. Communities will also learn the benefits and the challenges with vehicle electrification and how to advocate for electrification in a way that improves public health and well-being, preserves the environment while providing optimal access and affordability. So those are just a few of the examples of what communities will glean through the movement support resources that we are implementing. Thank you.
Sounds exciting, Jackie. We cannot wait to see further rollout of the Chisholm Legacy Project. Next question is, communities bearing the highest burden of impact have traditionally been left out of transit-oriented development decision-making processes. How do you work to elevate these communities and ensure they also have a seat at the table? Jackie, I'm going to start with you and work our way back.
Thank you. So yes, I guess picking up on, we're already talking about chairs and tables. So we're assisting communities with analyzing all of the places where the conversation is happening, as well as the places that the conversation should be happening. So in their local governments and state governments, that we'll also, so creating new tables where necessary and making sure there's a space at the table also. We're also working on finding the entry points that do exist and creating entry points that don't exist. So again, bringing a saw to carve a door where the entry points don't exist, and then really through all of that, after we've carved those places, really building knowledge and building power to implement change. So we're teaching communities to create the tables and entry points through strategies and tactics, following in the footsteps of people like Zach, who is part of the Labor Network for Sustainability. He created a seat at the table for differently able people who linked arms with transportation unions like the Transportation Workers Union of America. And together they were able to secure customer service trainings and union contracts, have disability complaint web pages on the transportation website. And the union is working closely with differently able communities so that they can have their perspectives shared in the training and education of drivers, resulting in changed attitudes. So like from kind of the micro level to the macro level, making sure that equity is centered in all levels of the process. Similarly, in Boston, youth came together and were supported by the Center for Story-Based Strategy, and they came up with a public communications campaign called Opportunity, because the name of the transit system there is the T, and their campaign resulted in a discounted T-Pass for students. They created a seat at the table of public opinion, which achieved their aim. So we're equipping communities at scale with the ability to create a way out of no way, so that whether it's directly engaging with decision makers or it's swaying public opinion, the end result is that communities are ensuring that systems are designed for us, by us. So thank you.
Excellent. Elizabeth, do you want to pick up on where Jackie left off, since she talked so much about the partnership with your network?
Yeah, and in my notes, I omitted to say earlier about Transit Equity Day that NAACP, when Jackie was there at the helm, but continuing, has been a real partner of ours, deep relationships there. You know, the specific question on housing, I want to confess, not very much knowledge about. I know it's hugely important, so my ignorance is not a reflection of where.
No worries, Elizabeth.
So, but just on the issue of a seat at the table, I think, yeah, that's one of the things that we're focusing on a lot, is how to bring labor to the table. As we all know, unfortunately, labor has not, in some ways, is at the table in an unhelpful way, in some regards historically, but that's changing. And maybe, you know, we can argue about whether it's changing quickly enough, but it is changing. And we want to bring the unions, particularly those unions who have the same principles and the same vision that we're espousing here, to partner with local community groups. That's happening to some extent at the national level, but it's so important that it happen at the local level. And the example that Jackie gave is really a fantastic one. Zach in the San Francisco area built this amazing partnership with the union, even though the beginnings of that relationship were fraught with tension and conflict. And both the union and Zach and his organizations sat down, understood each other's perspectives, and built a positive road forward. So that's what we're trying to do. But again, on the issue of housing, I defer to others, and I'm all ears and learning about it.
Thank you. Kate?
Sure, thank you. Um, so the role that the Georgetown Climate Center plays is sort of the other end of the table setting process, I guess I'd say. And so we are working with the states and cities in this region to help them provide more bigger tables with more seats and more doors and more access to the tables, and really trying to figure out what that looks like, and really grateful for a lot of input from community groups and individuals across the region to help us think better about how to work with the states on providing more bigger tables with more seats and all of the above. I mean, one of the things that the states are trying now, and can't promise this is figured out, but one of the things that we are exploring now is that the states that have committed to implementing the Transportation and Climate Initiative program have committed to creating or extending existing organizations into equity advisory bodies to inform their implementation of this program. And what they have committed to is to having groups that are in partnership with the states, working to help identify the disadvantaged and overburdened communities that should be prioritized for investment, to providing guidance on what investments should be made and where, to helping define the goals and progress that the states are making, and to ensuring that a majority of people on these bodies are coming from the communities themselves, so that is baked into the process from the beginning, and the states can get that kind of input all the way along the way. And again, that wouldn't be the case if it weren't for the kind of input that the states have already gotten from the folks who've been at the table already and have pulled up chairs and said, look, you've really got to make sure that this is baked in from the beginning.
And Sam, I'm going to tweak the question. Samuel, I'm going to tweak the question a little bit for you, in that, from my perspective as an environmental planner, I thought that the process to develop the red line compacts, was the gold standard of transportation planning. I've never seen it done at the level that it was done for the red line, which made it all the more bitter to see the process taken off the table and the planning taken off the table. What do you think about that process, Samuel? And is it replicable to transportation planning as we move forward in this next generation of transportation planning? What do you think about that?
Well, thank you, Vernice, because it's not only replicable, it's also advisable. That process to proceed with the full funding, full approval, community support for the red line was a 13-year process. Now, it doesn't have to take that long, but it engaged members of the community in community leaders, members of the communities, advocates, in a full education about what transportation is supposed to achieve. So we have, you might call them community experts in RTAs, for example, because one of our approaches is, in order to complete the Red Line Light Rail project, we do need to address structural racism with structural change. So we want to supplant the MDOT MTA model with a Baltimore Regional Transportation Authority that gives us more regional and local autonomy in policymaking. And it also gives us flexibility in funding strategies that we don't have now under the MDOT MTA Commanders model. But what it also means, and is very important, in fact, I'm glad in this symposium that Cecilia Martinez will be one of the, is a keynote speaker, because she can take this message back to the Biden administration. Why don't we just follow the law? The law is Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act says that, one, before you make any major transit changes, you have to conduct a prior transit analysis. MDOT MTA has never done that. Before you make a major transportation change, you must also consult with the members and leaders of the communities most directly affected. MDOT MTA does that after the fact. It also requires the presentation of an alternative less egregious than the change being proposed. MDOT MTA gave us the Baltimore link, and it's not even possible for anyone on this panel, certainly, to say that the Baltimore link has done at $135 million what the red line would do with $2.95 billion. The point I'm getting at here is that the law, Title VI, is not enforced at the federal level. And we proposed in the last legislative session, HB 1204, it was then, a proposal called the Maryland Transportation Equity Analyses and Assurances Act. It would require prior transit analyses. Had that bill been in effect in January of 2015, the red line would not have been canceled. But that's just part of it. Bringing the communities to the table is a requisite of the law as well. So we want to make sure the Biden administration understands that when they give out earmark funds or transit funds, and we're very grateful for the work done by Senators Cardin and Van Hollen in paving the path or developing a path toward funding the red line. But we must keep in mind that when the administration sends those funds out, they're sending the funds back to the same agencies that are responsible for the race-based transit policy in the first place. That has to be clear. When you send money in Baltimore to MDOT-MTA, you're going to get what we got on the 20th of September in 2020, when the most draconian cuts in the history of MTA, and especially the core bus service, were to be imposed on the core bus service with this 83% Black ridership. Modest cuts were proposed, were not even planned to be permanent, but only temporary, 8 to 4% on commuter rail, for example. So our approach is, one, enforce the law. And the federal government does not do that. We want this symposium to send that message or join us in a message, letter or campaign or appeal to the federal government. We also want to make sure that what we get in response is the participation of the communities involved, because that's required. Consultation with the members and leaders of the communities most directly affected. Now, the BRTA, a Baltimore Regional Transportation Authority, requires what we call, or produces what we call, enforceable cohesion among the participating jurisdictions. They can address housing, transit, the environment, public health, and food security. These are all intersectional with public transportation, as all of you know. Anyone in this city or state, by the way, who's earning under $40,000 and has more than one mouth to feed has a transportation problem. They have a housing problem, perhaps, but public health, food security, these are intersections that can be addressed when we make structural change, where we have found structural racism in making that choice to cancel the red line.
Got you. As you can see, there's a little bit of passion in Baltimore City, but in our state about the red line. But I think it is instructive as we think about transportation equity that sometimes the things that really could move us forward are the things that got cast to the wayside. And we might need to revisit a whole bunch of conversations that we've had in the past to pull forward what are the things that we need to use as models to go forward. And I would just say, as a planner, the red line model for transportation planning is the best thing that I've ever seen anywhere in this country. And if we could bring it back and use it as a model around the country, I think a lot of communities that have not been served by systems could be. And again, we're not jumping on the decision making. We're just saying that when good things happen, we should lift those good things up, right? So, yes. But again, you will hear us talk. Those of us who live in Maryland and those of us who live in the Baltimore region in particular are particularly fired up about the red line. So just, bear with us because it's our passion when it comes to transportation equity. Next question for the group. And Kate, I'm going to have you start off on this, and those who have comment about it, comment. Those who don't, feel free to pass. But the Transportation and Climate Initiative seeks to improve transportation, develop and improve clean energy economy, and reduce transportation emissions, especially carbon emissions. And is it possible that TCI can address those issues and address equity issues? Because some other platforms that have been similarly structured have not given us equanimity of benefits across all platforms. We've seen some places get lifted up and some places get bypassed. What do you think is going to be different about TCI and its implementation, Kate? And I want the other panelists to address this as well.
Happy to. Thank you, Vernice. So yes, we are trying to learn from history to your council there and really think about what can be done differently moving forward than the way that processes, policies were designed in the past. And I mentioned one of those, the creation of these equity advisory bodies to ensure that people have seats at the table, but we are trying to do more than that. We are trying to, one, ensure that we have mandatory emissions reductions across the entire region. We are also trying to ensure that those reductions and those investments are targeted to the communities that need them the most. And so how do we do that? A few of the things that the states are trying, and again, I will say that this is all sort of work in progress and very much informed by and improved by the input that the states have gotten. But one of the things that we heard loud and clear is that there is very little trust and there's very little confidence that dollars will go where people say they're going to go. We've already heard many of the reasons why that's the case. And so a few of the things that are being built into this process are, one, a multi-state regional commitment that at least, in this case, it was 35% of the investment that happens through the program would go to overburdened and underserved communities. A lot of the states are looking at the 40% commitment at the national level, and some of the states are already proposing to go farther. In particular, the legislation that's been introduced in Connecticut would ensure that 50% of the proceeds are invested in overburdened and underserved communities, and some of the states are looking at doing more. But the first part is this floor to make sure that at least this minimum of 35% would go. The equity advisory bodies would help identify what those communities are and also the projects that get invested in. And the other piece of that is transparency and circling back and checking, right? So you can make a lot of promises that don't come true. How do we ensure that those promises are transparent and visible, and that people can look back at them and point back at them? So a few of the things that we are exploring there are, one, the idea that each state will develop, one, a community engagement process that will be spelled out explicitly. And two, that's a part of a bigger commitment to an implementation plan where each state, there's an outline that has been out for public comment for the last few months. Each state will write down its cohesive plan to implement this program, and it will describe what its equity advisory body will look like and how it will be created and how it will be supported and how it will be enabled to participate meaningfully. Each state will write in this plan how it will develop a transparent process for deciding how the money gets spent. Each state will articulate in this plan how it'll be transparent about circling back with data to inform new rounds of the process. And so it will be described there in a way that community members can look at and say, okay, this is the commitment the state has made. This is the commitment this is the place they are telling me I can weigh in, and I can check this and I can see whether they follow through. There's also a commitment to data collection for air quality monitoring and other impacts of the program to circle back and say, well, gee, did that work? Did it achieve the goals that we were looking for? So part of it is this just transparency and clarity around telling the story about how the program will be implemented so people can watch it and weigh in and provide input and check back and see whether it succeeded or not. And again, this is all really due to the tremendous input that we've already received on the program, with hundreds and hundreds of comments from folks in the region providing input on what they need from their communities and their policymakers.
Thank you. And I know that there's more, and hopefully people will go on the website of the Georgetown Climate Center to see all the other equity dimensions that have been brought forward, all because of the comment and the input that have happened from stakeholders. But I want to just lift up Samuel and Jackie, who have given a lot of input into that process about how to make it the most transparent and the most impactful. And I'm going to ask them to speak on it. But first, I'm going to ask Elizabeth. Elizabeth, I participated in a public outreach conversation around TCI with stakeholders in Rhode Island, and the president of the Rhode Island AFL-CIO was a part of the conversation and had a lot of thought about how labor needed to be centered in this process. What do you and your network think about that in terms of TCI and how it's trying to improve transportation and develop its various components?
Yeah, labor does need to be at the table, and that's been a difficult challenge, in large part just frankly, in the last year because of the pandemic. As everyone knows, unions have just been I mean, they've seen their members dying, and it's just been a very difficult time for unions throughout the country. So talking to them about TCI, sometimes they're like, we just can't do that now. So it's been a resource challenge, but I give a lot of hats off and thumbs up to you, Vernice, and the efforts that you've put forward recently in your organization, and also to Georgetown Climate Center. One of the purposes, articulated purposes in the model draft model rule is to promote local economic opportunity and creating high quality jobs. And we've participated in trying to flesh out some details around that. Those are nice words, but as we all know, the devil is in the details. And I have to say, we were a little disappointed in the first round of output, because they had that as one of their purposes, and literally not one word as to how that purpose would be met. But in their most recent round of documents, there were some significant changes, and from our point of view, all to the good, to really think about how we can use investments to invest in our communities. If we take millions of dollars to buy electric buses, for example, and buy them from China, that does not help Baltimore. It does not help Maryland. Right. So that's what we've been focused on. And I'll turn to others, because I know the equity considerations have also been top of mind for Jackie and Samuel.
Samuel, I know you've been at that table, or trying to be at that table.
Yes, with TCI we have, and in fact, from the early conferences, and I've been to Newark, to Philadelphia,
Baltimore,
conference in Baltimore, where we met, a kind of wall with respect to some of the issues we raised. I think there's a possibility of them being addressed, but there were several issues. One was enforcement, because there's a sort of a fundamental belief I have that the private sector won't save us from climate change. But, walk away when the bottom line is no longer being satisfied by the corporate boards. Then what do? Well, we talked about enforcement. We asked about enforcement. We don't have an answer yet, because when that stops, we're going to need some sort of mandatory regulatory system. We don't have that yet. Too many people call that socialism, but the livability of the climate is at stake. The survival of the species is at stake. So we have actually proposed, or we have a project, in fact, reported on our project with Johns Hopkins will be released at the end of this month, beginning of the next month. It's a simple mapping process in which we map transit equity, what's called survivability index, health, public health issues, where we find them, and pollution. And when we overlay those maps, we have the identification of the communities most in need of investments, most in need of mitigation, most in need of a reduction of the impact of harmful emissions generated by the transportation sector. As most of you know, the transportation sector generates 35 to 40% of the harmful emissions in this country. But we need to address these issues, and once they're identified, that isn't the end of the story. Once they're identified, we have to work with those communities to determine the dimension of the damage done. Historically and currently, empirical evidence. What has happened to the economy? What has happened to the health? How many more than 50% of the children have asthma? We have to answer these questions. And once that kind of dimensional discussion has been undertaken, we then put a price tag on it. What will it cost? Once we know that, then we can appeal to the TCI Treasury and find out, is there money to resolve this question you say you want to resolve? So it's not with cynicism, it's that we challenge the TCI process. And when we are doing that, I want to make sure that my comment earlier about Title VI, keep in mind, it's not just an abstraction. BTEC filed a Title VI complaint against the governor and the state of Maryland. We began agitating to complete the red line from within 2 hours of Hogan's cancellation of the red line. Yeah, why? Yeah. Because it is absolutely a game changer for Baltimore and the region. And I want to make that just clear. 10,000 jobs. You can't walk away from 10,000 jobs and then complain about crime, unemployment, and poverty, as the governor has done. And I don't want to call his name too many times. It's that we also have this question of the cross-modal analysis. You know, when you look at this, we have to have budgeting that indicates we want to honestly invest in public transportation. The pandemic has shown us that public transportation must be a growing sector of the economy and our budgetary concerns. Yeah. But at present, when you look at the Maryland Department of Transportation budget, 77% of the budget goes to state highway administration. Only 2% goes to MTA. And with that 2%, they conduct all of the core bus service, the commuter rail, commuter bus, subway, and light rail.
And he's talking about for our whole state, not just for Baltimore City,
absolutely, for the entire state. And Jackie is shaking her head because she knows that's a clear problem. What can we do? Well, we have to have a great look. In fact, a humanity survival look at that budget. Which is a better path to a healthy planet, healthy cities, livable, walkable cities? 77% of the money going to roads and highways, or 77% of the money going to mass transit for livable, walkable, breathable urban area? It means that we must change the concept of the cities we live in.
Absolutely.
We have to. So I want to make this clear also, that when we talk about the red line and that process you mentioned, Vernice, not only was it admirable, it was successful, but now we need to talk about what it takes to revive it or complete it.
Yes.
Right now, of course, it needs a political will. It needs the money. And we got a chance now to at least begin assembling that. But it also needs the reevaluation of the red line final environmental impact study.
Indeed.
And if we can get that done through an agreement with the U.S. Department of Transportation, we don't have to start from scratch.
Thank you. And I'm going to connect all of these dots when we get to the end of this conversation. Jackie, weigh in.
Thank you. So I mean, from our kind of perspective at the national level, but also being situated in Maryland, but really talking more about kind of the model as communities from Park Heights to Port Arthur to Princeville to Puerto Rico to Port-au-Prince to Paradise, California can attest, we are way beyond the point where we can rely on cajoling and coddling the barons of the predator economy through this shell game that we call carbon pricing and market-based mechanisms that have really never worked from our communities from the time that we were actually the commodities that were traded in the first markets of this place now called the United States. So from the standpoint of so many of the frontline communities, we really are saying that it's too late for kind of incrementalism and hoping that the market will work this issue out. We really are calling for straight up regulations. As Samuel said, the stakes are way too high and the implications are dire, including fatal. So we need, instead of kind of cap and trade or cap and whatever, we need to cap and criminalize. We also need to really be thinking about, because part of even the ways that we're thinking about having these market-based mechanisms is really coming from a scarcity mindset. Like there's only so many resources, so we need to kind of move them around and do this and that the best that we can under these constrained circumstances. But we've seen, even through how we've dealt with COVID-19, that really where there's a will, there's a way. And we have seen where resources were generated seemingly out of nothing. And so when we have the political will, we can do what needs to be done. We need to really work on shifting subsidies from the fossil fuel economy to clean energy. We need to have stronger measures and regulations to ensure that all development is transit-oriented development. Transit-oriented development shouldn't be like this thing. It should be the thing. Like it shouldn't be like a thing on the side or something that's optional. It should be the only way that we do development. We need to have requirements for electrification of buses and freight vehicles combined with the incentives and subsidies to make that transition. We need to ensure that we have in all things that we do, local hire provisions, disadvantaged business enterprise provisions, fair chance hiring to ensure equitable access to jobs and economic opportunity. And we really need to to make sure that we are prioritizing people and the well-being of communities over profits. And so I know that's all kind of conceptual, but I think that those are kind of principles and practices, and that analysis needs to undergird what we think about whether we're, whether we're designing TCI or designing our broader systems. We have to really be thinking aspirationally and really thinking no holds barred in terms of the resources that it's going to take to save the planet and protect the lives that are literally being lost on a daily basis now from our false priorities in the past. So I'll just, thank you.
Can I add a quick comment, Vernice? That is that in addition to answer this, in the past 6 decades, the most robust generator of economic and community development in this nation is light rail. Not only does it give us a chance to greatly improve transit equity, but it also gives us that chance to reduce congestion and the harmful emissions of the transit sector.
So that's why this panel is so important, because we're trying to recenter how we think about growth and development, how we think about equity, how we think about meeting historical wrongs. All of those things can be driven through this conversation, through these efforts. But we gotta recenter and rethink and reconceptualize what we mean by transportation planning. We know what we've done in the past. We cannot replicate what we've done in the past and then do it again and then expect different outcomes that are more sustainable and more just, right? So that is the whole purpose of having this conversation. And I want to just ask one more question, and I'm gonna collapse a lot of our final 3 questions into one question because they're all really related. Our region is undergoing a number of changes related to transportation infrastructure, though the benefits will not be felt across every community. What changes would you think need to be made in our region? And that includes the Baltimore maglev, DC maglev train, the Red Line, airport expansion, intracity bus efforts, a bus system and a transit system that really connects our whole region, which we really don't have. We have one of the few states, I think, in the nation that you cannot get to the state capital via public transportation, which to me is just insane, right? So what do we need in our region? And what would meet those needs? What are some of the investments, and what do you think about some of these big mega projects that are being discussed? Can they address the inequities that we've experienced in the past? And I'm going to start with Elizabeth.
Thanks, Vernice. Wow, that's a jam-packed question. Let me start with maglev. Well, let me start 50,000 feet up. We need a system. Right now, we've got this balkanized system that elevates highways and cars over people and communities. So right away, we need to switch the way in which we're thinking about transportation, including transit. So that's number one. In that vein, if you look at maglev, the idea that private sector investment alone without government and community involvement in the development of it is going to get us out of the problem, when it was that very framework that got us into the problem, seems to be misplaced. And just, for those who don't know, maglev sounds real great on the surface, but honestly, it would be, if it were developed, it would be a great boon for very wealthy people and a great disservice to MARC in improving MARC and to regular working people. But back to the planning aspect of this, a lot of the things that Kate talked about and Jackie talked about, even though they were approaching the TCI conversation from very different places, there were some things that there was some great overlap. And one of that is from the beginning, and I know Samuel preaches this much better than I will be able to, but from the beginning, you need the community at the table. And by community, we mean working people, in all segments of, in our case, Maryland, in all segments of the state. And we need the interests of working people represented. So that includes labor. And yes, there's tensions, and yes, there's going to be friction, and yes, there's not always going to be agreement, but by working through those at the beginning of a project, rather than at the very tail end, I think we'll build both a powerful movement and also a transportation system. But if I were to say one thing, it's this worshiping at the altar of highways rather than at communities and getting people where they want to go. It's not that complicated. Travel is something, transportation is something that really is a basic human right. People need to get to where they need to go and want to go. And our system is really not intended to do that.
Thank you. Samuel, I'm going to ask you next, but I'm going to ask you to make it condensed, your response, so we can maybe try to get a couple of questions in.
No, I'll leave the maglev discussion and the others issues with Elizabeth's comments, because the communities in Cherry Hill, Westport have rejected the maglev. Then what happens?
And here in Bowie, Maryland as well.
And what has happened is that all of a sudden the Sun publishes a report that says 72% of the people in Baltimore support the maglev. I'll stop there. There's not that much more to say. The maglev cannot be the highest priority if a single mom with 2 children under 6 needs to get from Allendale to McElderry Park area for childcare and then get to Bayview for work in 45 minutes. That's not a maglev. That's urban rail. That's the red line doing its job. I'll pass on any other comment on that question.
Jackie?
Sorry, I don't know why I didn't expect that. I'll just say, as you said, that's not specific to the maglev, but really kind of underlining the points that were made. As the Bible says, we can't put new wine in old wineskin.
That's right.
Yes, we need to closely examine the failures of the past, as your question posed. So we look at the junctures and mechanisms by which well-intended programming and policies were executed by ill-designed implementation. How did urban renewal become urban removal? How did opportunity zones become a windfall for developers while leaving communities holding an empty bag? How did the war on drugs become the war on communities? And then, as we said, the transportation system that's consistently put our communities in harm's way while leaving our communities out of access and affordability. So we really need to closely examine where these efforts went wrong so we don't repeat those mistakes. And so where was it the good intentions that went awry? And where was it that these programs and policies did exactly what they were designed to do, even though they were dressed up with pretty words touting equity and access and opportunity? Again, the simple answer comes back to what other panelists have said. Whenever the community is not involved, either by intent or not, programming is not going to be successful in meeting the community needs. So we have to put communities at the center, and not just in a performative way like we have this community advisory board, but we really have to make sure that we have mechanisms for decision making, following the path of the folks at We the People of Detroit and others who have really worked with municipalities and state leadership to put in mechanisms where communities are in the driver's seat and making decisions around the course that the car is taking, or the bus or the light rail. Thank you.
Thank you. And Kate, what do you think about what's happening in our region? You not only do you lead a center that's here in the region, but you live here in the region, though you're home in Detroit. Where are we going as a region, Kate, and where could we be going?
I guess I'd like to answer that with a little anecdote from a public meeting I was at a couple of years ago, where a bunch of state officials who were really trying to do good asked a bunch of people in the neighborhood a question about, like, how can we help you all drive cleaner vehicles, right? Buy more electric vehicles. And the folks at the meeting said, what? Like, I don't have a car. I'm not buying a car. I don't know about your incentive programs for EVs, but I'm trying to take the bus and it doesn't come on time and there's no bus stop and it's not safe and it's not covered and I can't take my kid there and it's not reliable. And you know, my town is on a commuter line that doesn't run when work hours happen or when my work hours happen, and it's not useful to me. And so, you know, I think where we're going is what everyone has advised, which is that people know what they need and they know what's going to get them to work and to jobs and to school and to the grocery store, and they know how to get there safely and affordably. And we just need more of those tables and chairs and doors and figure out how to connect the people, decisions to the people who know what they need. And that's there in our region.
Well, I'm sorry that we talked through the time for the Q&A, and I'm checking the chat. And one thing I just want to lift up, somebody asked if we could lift up the name of, where's that? Of Miss Colvin, who led the first boycott against discriminatory public transit. That was before the Montgomery bus boycott. We need to lift up our heroes, but we also need to see how connected these conversations are, right? Dr. Wilson mentioned in his opening comments about the disproportionate impact of COVID on our communities. And why is that related to this conversation? Because we see, and there's been lots of research that's documented this, that the higher levels of particulate pollution that your community is exposed to, the more likely you are to develop COVID and the more likely you are to die from COVID. Here in Prince George's County, Maryland, and in Baltimore City, we had the highest rates of COVID mortality in the state of Maryland. Wow, I wonder if that's related to the ring of transportation and highways and byways that crisscross our city and our county. I wonder if those things are related. The generation of particulate pollution here, you're damn right they're related, right? Of course they're related. Thinking about human-centered development, human-centered needs, public health, educational access, job access, opportunity, all of that is related to this conversation. And I just want to say to you all, as we break for lunch and then come back this afternoon, that we cannot think of transportation equity and access as some separate conversation. Somebody said that in this conversation. It might have been Samuel. This is core to environmental justice and equity. If you can't be safe, if you can't have access to the things that you need, if you can't get around without having a car, then you are not living in the modern society. And we need those investments to come back to us. Samuel broke it down about how Maryland is continuing to invest in the road infrastructure, right? And not public transit. So if you really care about these issues, you need to lift up your voice at the national level. You need to lift up your voice at the regional level. You need to lift up your voice in your city, in your county. But this is a critical issue for us as we go forward. And I would just ask that you all think about this. When you think about all the environmental issues you work on, all the public health issues you work on, recognize that public transit and transportation investment is critical to every one of those conversations. And I'm sorry that we talk so much and that I talk so much that we didn't get a chance for Q&A, but thank you all for coming. I think we had 89 people in this session. Thank you all for joining us. And I think we're breaking for lunch now, and then we're going to come back this afternoon for our next round of conversation. Thank you to each of the panelists. You were tremendous. Thank you for bringing your full selves, for not holding back, for giving us your real opinions. And I hope we can continue to do some work together, all of us. Thank you so much. Thank you, audience.
Thank you so much. Did someone mention passion, Vernice?
Dr. Wilson is the holder of the passion. Thank you all.
Thank you.